He said to the Daily Mail, "As soon as I saw that Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle were murdered, I knew exactly who it was." Stay up in the night talking about his parents, saying, quote, how much he effing hated his parents.
I keep replaying this situation in my head again and again because nothing about it feels right or settled at all. Every angle feels crooked. Every detail sparks more questions. And the deeper I looked, the heavier it started to feel. The story surrounding Nick Reiner is packed with loose ends, and the more I dug in, the more uncomfortable it became. You start wondering how much pressure builds inside someone before everything finally snaps, especially when the outcome leaves Rob and Michelle Reiner no longer here. That reality alone stops you in your tracks. This wasn't just some distant headline or abstract tragedy. This was a family collapse with no clean answers. What really shook me was learning that someone actually lived side by side with Nick during one of the hardest periods of his life. A guy named Danny Lahr came forward and shared that they stayed in the same room at a high-end rehab facility in Malibu when they were both young. This wasn't a casual program or some low-level setup. This was elite recovery, the kind of place charging close to $60,000 a month. Money most people will never see in their lifetime. Danny wasn't chasing attention and didn't want to keep doing interviews, and you could feel that. But he stood firm on what he shared, and that made it hit even harder. He said the moment he heard about what happened later, something instantly clicked in his mind. No confusion, no doubt, just a gut-punch realization that rattled him deeply. He explained that he entered rehab due to a behavioral addiction, and during that time he genuinely connected with Nick. According to Danny, Nick's parents went all in trying to help their son, putting massive resources into treatment, therapy, and support without holding back. That adds a heavy layer to this story because it shows a family trying to fix things long before everything unraveled. But the nights were different, and that's where things shifted fast. Danny said Nick would stay awake for hours, unloading nonstop about his parents, filled with resentment, anger, and a bitterness that never cooled off. This wasn't light venting. It was intense, emotional, and constant. The kind of stuff that sticks with you long after the lights go out. Nick talked openly about frustration, about fame, about feeling trapped by it all. What stood out most was the lack of appreciation. Danny said it was shocking to watch someone surrounded by privilege, opportunity, and non-stop support act like none of it mattered at all. That contrast hit him immediately. Danny didn't sugarcoat Nick's attitude. He said Nick showed zero gratitude, acting entitled, reckless, and locked into doing whatever he wanted. According to him, Nick was focused on chasing impulses while his family stayed locked in on keeping him safe and helping him heal. That gap between effort and attitude was impossible to miss. At first, Nick seemed friendly, even funny, someone who could easily blend in and get laughs. But Danny said that version faded fast. Once the cracks showed, things escalated quickly. Nick had a temper that could flip without warning, and Danny personally witnessed him lash out at another teen inside the facility. This wasn't rumors or secondhand talk. He saw it with his own eyes. Eventually, that same anger turned toward Danny. After one serious blow-up, they were never roommates again. One moment stayed burned into Danny's memory. He once made a casual comment comparing Nick to John Travolta's son. Nothing serious at all. That single remark set Nick off instantly. Nick stepped into his space, turned aggressive, and even raised his fist before staff rushed in and broke it up. Danny wouldn't name the rehab, but he made one thing clear. This place was ultra luxury, the kind most people will never experience. We're talking $60,000 a month with yoga sessions, massages, private chefs, and every comfort imaginable. Despite all that, Nick constantly made comments that bothered Danny, especially about his parents. What hit hardest was how little Nick seemed to value their effort. Danny said he had nothing but respect for Rob and Michelle, describing them as deeply involved, present, and willing to do anything to help their son. That made Nick's attitude even harder to understand. Danny said Nick's parents stood out compared to everyone else there. Most families stayed distant, relying on updates or staff reports. Rob and Michelle showed up every time. Every group meeting, every therapy session, even when it wasn't required. Danny said he even played frisbee with Rob once, and it was obvious they cared about one thing only: getting their son healthy again. What stayed with Danny the most was how Nick talked about his parents behind closed doors. He said Nick openly spoke about hating them, especially his father, and this was back when they were still teenagers. That level of anger shocked Danny right away. He said it stuck with him because from everything he witnessed, there was no real reason for rage that deep. Nick blamed fame for his problems, saying his parents caused everything, but Danny kept it straight. His parents wanted him to succeed, and Nick simply didn't want to change at all. Danny said everyone in that place had family issues. Nobody was pretending life was perfect. Still, most people understood one thing clearly: they were lucky to have support. Nick stood out, and not in a good way. His resentment never cooled off, never softened, never faded. That detail mattered more than anything else. That's why, years later, when the news about Rob and Michelle came out, one name instantly hit Danny's mind. He said the connection was immediate, like a memory sitting quietly in the background, waiting. No hesitation, no second guessing. It just clicked. What made this even more unsettling was what came out afterward. Danny wasn't alone in thinking this way at all. Other people close to the family quietly landed on the same conclusion without talking to each other. Most stayed silent out of respect. Nobody wanted to damage Rob or Michelle's reputation, especially when everyone described them the same way. Loving, committed, hands-on parents who showed up and did everything possible for their kids. That description was consistent across the board. But behind closed doors, a pattern kept showing up. When multiple people reach the same thought independently, that says something serious. It shows how far back the warning signs really went, and how long this tension had been building under the surface. I kept thinking about how rare this kind of situation actually is. When something horrific happens, people don't usually look at a family member right away, especially not a child. That kind of suspicion only forms when there's a long history behind it. According to Danny and others, this anger wasn't recent. It went way back. What disturbed me most was what Danny shared about the nights they spent in the same room. After lights out, Nick would stay awake and talk non-stop about his parents. Even at 15, he went on long, angry rants, repeating how much he hated them. Hearing that level of rage existed so early made the whole story feel heavier and impossible to ignore. It made me think about comparison. Maybe Nick questioned why people respected his parents more than him. The answer felt obvious. Rob and Michelle earned respect through decades of discipline, work, and consistency. From everything I heard, Nick never built that same drive. Responsibility didn't seem to be pushed early on. Structure didn't feel firm enough to force growth. That kind of environment can shape someone in ways people don't notice until it's too late. I couldn't help but wonder if things would have turned out differently with real structure early on, real expectations, real accountability. Because when accountability doesn't show up, entitlement usually does, and that changes a person fast. Maybe things shift when someone is held responsible from a young age. Maybe they don't. But it's hard to ignore how different paths create completely different people. Once you see it that way, the gaps get loud. What became crystal clear to me was how important voices like Danny's are, especially now that he's cooperating with prosecutors and laying everything out. Investigators don't brush off this kind of history, not when patterns stretch back years. I knew staff inside those rehab facilities couldn't speak openly. Their mouths are locked by contracts and money. Former roommates are different, though. Once those voices speak up, it's only a matter of time before everything surfaces. Digging into someone's past isn't quick or clean. You have to trace records, timelines, money, locations, then loop back to the people who were actually there. It's slow, detailed work that takes patience and pressure. I've seen how far investigators go when something truly matters. This isn't rushed or sloppy. The deeper they dig, the more history crawls back up, and a lot of this will resurface once the trial starts. That's exactly what I expected. I kept asking whether events from over 15 years ago really mattered. From everything I understand, they absolutely do. It proves the anger didn't appear out of nowhere one day. It wasn't triggered by one bad moment or a single excuse. This had been building quietly for years. That's why the past matters so much here. If the defense tries to pin everything on medication issues, that argument starts cracking the moment you look backward. What kept showing up was the same pattern. Even back then, his focus stayed locked on chasing substances and chasing an image. He didn't just want to escape his life. He wanted the same respect and admiration his parents had, and he believed he deserved it without earning it. That part sticks hard. At that age, he wasn't involved in anything extreme, just marijuana, yet the resentment was already loud and clear. He couldn't fully explain it because he was young, but the anger was raw and constant. That kind of long-term hostility is exactly what prosecutors look for. It shows this wasn't sudden and didn't come out of nowhere. What kept hitting me again and again was the money involved. We're talking rehab costs allegedly reaching $60,000 a month. That number alone makes you question how those places really operate behind closed doors. When families are paying that kind of cash, you start wondering what gets overlooked. From what I was told, unless someone is seriously injured, a lot of incidents stay quiet. Problems get handled internally, kept low-key, and never officially reported. That silence adds another disturbing layer to this situation. When money talks that loudly, accountability often whispers, and that changes everything. The more I thought about it, the more it reminded me of how older mental health facilities used to operate. And honestly, some of that mindset never disappeared. These places are built to handle issues internally, with staff trained to step in, physically calm situations, restrain people if needed, and rely heavily on medication instead of outside involvement. They're treated as medical environments, so privacy rules kick in hard. That means most incidents never leave the building. They don't hit reports. They don't reach anyone outside those walls. Everything stays contained, controlled, and quiet. It also brought me back to something I mentioned earlier about how wealthy families often handle problems, especially in cities like Los Angeles. There's a long pattern of keeping authorities out whenever possible. Everything gets handled behind closed doors, protection on one side, accountability on the other. I once told a friend dealing with a disruptive neighbor to document everything, build a paper trail so if things escalated, there would be proof. But when it's your own child, that logic flips fast. The last thing parents want is a permanent record following their kid forever. So they do everything possible to prevent that. And when money isn't an issue, controlling situations quietly becomes much easier. You can hire professionals, private programs, private security, and specialists whose entire job is to keep things contained. For many families, that feels like the safest move, even if it creates serious problems later. I kept asking where the line really is when rehabs and private teams step in. If aggressive behavior keeps escalating, there has to be a point where outside authorities get involved, especially when people are getting hurt. From everything I learned, one thing was clear. Nick had repeated aggressive incidents from a very young age. One story Danny shared stuck with me more than anything. He described an outburst where Nick completely lost control and threw a rock through a stained glass window inside a chapel. In most situations, that would come with serious consequences. Instead, what stood out was how light the response always seemed. It felt like the consequences Nick faced were only a fraction of what they should have been over the years. I will say this, though. It genuinely seemed like Rob and Michelle tried everything they could. They didn't ignore the problem or look away. They sent him to stricter programs, including one known for being demanding and confrontational, the kind that forces you to face issues head-on. Danny also talked about Nick's resentment toward fame. He said Nick carried deep anger toward his parents' success, like it was always sitting there, eating at him quietly. That resentment wasn't just about pressure, it was about comparison, wanting the same respect without building the same foundation. When that feeling sits unresolved for years, it doesn't fade. It hardens, and that changes everything. I couldn't stop thinking about how jealousy works, because once it takes root, it spreads fast. If nobody checks it, resentment can grow fast when someone sees money, status, or respect they don't have. It starts quiet and then explodes later. I've always believed success should be respected, not resented, and that mindset has never failed me. When people make it big, my instinct is genuine happiness and respect for the work it took. But Nick didn't live in that mindset at all. From everything I heard, gratitude just wasn't there. Instead, he kept circling one question in his head. Why do my parents have success, respect, and attention, while I don't? Everything stayed locked on himself and what he believed he was owed, not what he built or earned, but what he felt entitled to. That difference matters more than people realize. Danny picked up on it fast, and it bothered him deeply. He said Nick never seemed to value how much his parents actually cared. From Danny's view, Rob and Michelle weren't distant or hands-off like many parents at that rehab. They were fully involved, present, and consistent every step of the way. They showed up for meetings, family weekends, and therapy sessions, dropping everything just to be there for their son. Thinking about that weighs heavy because that level of commitment is rare. I kept wondering if Nick ever truly appreciated it, or if that bitterness was always sitting just under the surface. It's hard to imagine being surrounded by that much care and still feeling disconnected. What I was told is that Nick could be highly manipulative. He knew how to play a role when it benefited him. He could act grateful when it served his interests, pulling people back in just enough to keep control. According to Danny, that pattern repeated again and again. Charm when it worked, withdrawal when it didn't. That made everything feel calculated and unsettling. Nick blamed most of his problems on fame, but the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like the real issue was his attitude. There was no gratitude, just ego and self-focus. People don't respond well to grown men throwing tantrums, and it sounded like he never grasped that reality. I can't help but wonder if things might have turned out differently if he had faced real consequences earlier. Sometimes shielding someone too much does more harm than good. I kept coming back to the idea of letting someone hit a hard wall so the lesson finally sticks. Boundaries matter, especially early on when structure and accountability are set. When they aren't, behavior can spiral fast and pulling it back becomes nearly impossible. As much as Rob and Michelle tried to help, part of me wonders if letting him fall harder at certain moments could have changed everything. It's an uncomfortable thought, but sometimes real consequences are the only thing strong enough to break a destructive cycle. Shielding non-stop can feel like love, but it can also quietly feed the problem. What Danny told me made one thing clear. He doesn't buy the idea of an insanity defense at all. From his view, this anger toward Nick's parents didn't suddenly appear. It stretched back years to when they were teenagers, and that long history is why blaming everything on mental instability now doesn't add up to him. One word kept surfacing again and again: manipulation. It didn't come up once or twice. It came from different people, different moments, different angles. I started wondering if Nick could actually fool psychiatric experts into believing something that isn't true. From what I understand, that wouldn't be easy. These professionals work in this space every day. They don't ask one question and move on. They circle the same issues repeatedly, testing consistency over time. If someone is putting on an act, cracks usually show. You can only hold a mask for so long before it slips. On top of that, I expect more people to speak once the trial begins. There will likely be stories about manipulation, repeated behavior, and past incidents never discussed publicly. When those people take the stand and face tough questions, it's going to paint a much fuller picture. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if uncomfortable details finally come out. I keep thinking about all the people who were around Rob and Michelle for years. Friends who quietly watched everything unfold from the sidelines, not once, but repeatedly. These were grown adults sitting at dinner tables, holidays, and events, seeing pieces most outsiders never saw. Watching Nick act out again and again, I can almost picture the conversations people had on the drive home. quiet moments where friends asked themselves if he would ever grow out of it, or if this was simply who he was becoming. Those longtime friends are going to matter when this goes to trial. They didn't witness one bad moment. They watched patterns unfold over time, and that kind of perspective carries real weight. That's why this case feels so intense to me. So many people saw different pieces of the same story forming slowly over the years, and through all of it, one thing never changed. Rob and Michelle never stopped trying. They didn't walk away even when things kept going sideways again and again. From everything I understand, people with money and influence don't always see reality clearly. Not because they're malicious, but because access and insulation warp how problems look. Issues are expected to resolve quietly, smoothly, neatly. And when they don't, everything collapses fast, and people are left scrambling to control something already spiraling. In those situations, all you can really do is offer honest, grounded advice without sugarcoating it. At the end of the day, the decisions are theirs, but people in those positions usually want outside perspectives before acting. From what I learned, Rob did exactly that. He listened to professionals, weighed options, and refused to act on impulse. I've always believed when something breaks, you go to people who actually know what they're doing. If my car breaks down, I'm not guessing or hoping. I take it straight to an expert and follow instructions. That same logic clearly guided how they handled Nick's situation, and that part made sense to me. But the money question kept nagging at me. When rehab programs cost $60,000 a month, you have to wonder if some places keep offering new solutions instead of telling uncomfortable truths. At some point, someone has to ask why the support never really changes and whether real consequences might have mattered more. From what I understand, rehab centers quietly talk among themselves, sharing what worked and what didn't. Even short-term improvements sometimes get praised as major wins, which can keep the cycle going instead of stopping it. The people I heard from were far more cautious, warning others away from certain places when the same patterns kept repeating. I didn't have much exposure to those flashy rehabs aimed at wealthy families, but I kept hearing better things about tougher programs in places like Utah. The stripped-down, no-frills environments sounded more grounded, more real, and less performative. That's why the idea of a $60,000 a month rehab felt unreal to me. Paying that much and still sharing rooms made no sense. Even if there was a clinical explanation, what I heard about yoga sessions, massages, and private chefs only added to the confusion. When I looked into expert opinions, even professionals questioned it. One well-known doctor said he'd be skeptical of any rehab charging anywhere near that amount, explaining that past a certain point, the price stops reflecting treatment and starts reflecting branding. That logic was hard to argue with. What really caught my attention later was a story about a Thanksgiving dinner. Someone who was there said Nick made comments showing zero appreciation, openly rejecting the moment and the people around him. He reportedly spoke with entitlement, referring to the house as his and dismissing others at the table. By that point, it didn't even shock me anymore. It fit the same pattern I kept hearing about again and again. Resentment, entitlement, a total lack of gratitude, and even in moments where most people would slow down and reflect, what I heard next screamed ego at full volume. Imagine someone who hadn't really built anything for himself, accusing others of freeloading. That kind of upside-down thinking says everything.